Welcome. Settle in, get comfortable, and let the world outside slowly fade away. Tonight, we are going somewhere that most history books quietly skip over. We are going underground, into the stone chambers beneath castles and cathedrals, into the rooms with no windows and no sunlight, where some of the most terrifying chapters of human history were written in silence. If you are lying down right now, good. Let your body sink a little deeper, because what you are about to hear is not the history of kings and conquests. It is the history of what happened when the door closed and no one was watching. 100 facts, 100 windows into the darkest corners of the medieval world. Not told to shock you, not told to entertain you with violence, but told because this history is real, because the people who lived it were human beings exactly like you and me, and because the truth, even when it is uncomfortable, is always worth knowing. So take a breath, let your thoughts slow down, and let us begin. The medieval period runs from roughly the 5th century all the way to the end of the 15th, 1,000 years, long enough for entire languages to be born and die, long enough for empires to rise, collapse, and be forgotten. And woven through every single one of those centuries, quietly and officially, and with the full backing of law, was the practice of torture. Not hidden, not shameful, not performed in secret by criminals. Performed openly, recorded in court documents, approved by magistrates, blessed by priests, and carried out by men who went home afterward to their families and their suppers, as if nothing unusual had happened. To understand how that was possible, you have to understand how medieval people thought about justice, about truth, and about the human body. In the medieval world, there were no detectives. There was no forensic science. There were no fingerprints or witnesses captured on camera. What courts had, and what courts depended on entirely, was confession, a person's own words, their own admission of guilt. And because words could be bought and lies could be told, the medieval legal mind developed a solution that seemed, within its own logic, almost reasonable. If pain could be applied carefully and systematically, and if a person under that pain still spoke, then what they said must be the truth. The body, pushed past its limits, could not lie. That was the belief. That was the foundation on which an entire architecture of suffering was built and maintained for 1,000 years. The Church gave this system its moral language. Roman law gave it its legal framework, and the slow accumulation of centuries gave it its instruments, its specialists, its official procedures, and its paperwork. Because that is the detail that surprises people most when they first encounter it. Medieval torture was not chaos, it was bureaucracy. There were warrants to be signed. There were rules about who could be subjected to it and who could not. There were official witnesses required to be present. There were scribes whose only job was to write down whatever the person said while it was happening. The suffering was real and raw and human. The system around it was organized, professional, and deeply, deeply ordinary. And it is in that ordinariness that the true darkness lives. The rack was the instrument that defined medieval torture in the popular imagination, and it earned that reputation honestly. It was a wooden frame, rectangular with a fixed bar at one end and a rotating roller at the other. The victim was laid flat on the frame, wrists tied to the roller, ankles fixed to the opposite end. Then the roller was turned. Slowly, the body stretched, tendons pulled tight, joints began to separate. The first sounds the device made were not screams. They were creaks, the wood of the frame. And then, beneath the wood, the quieter and far more disturbing sounds of a body being taken past what bodies are designed to endure. The rack was used in England, France, Germany, Spain, and across the Italian states. It was used on men and women, on nobles and peasants, on the accused, and sometimes simply on those who knew the accused. The expression we still use today, racked with pain, comes directly from this device. The language of that instrument is still alive in our mouths, centuries after the last rack was dismantled. The oubliette was a different kind of cruelty entirely. Where the rack attacked the body directly, the oubliette attacked something more fragile. The word is French, and it means simply to forget. An oubliette was a vertical shaft cut into stone, sometimes into the floor of a dungeon, sometimes into the walls of a castle tower. Wide enough for a human body, not wide enough for anything else. A person could be lowered in by rope and left, not interrogated, not sentenced to death, simply left. The darkness inside an oubliette was not the partial darkness of a room with shuttered windows. It was total, absolute, the kind of darkness that, after enough hours, begins to feel like it has weight. Prisoners kept in oubliettes for months emerged, if they emerged at all, in states that contemporaries described with words like mad and hollow. Some could not speak. Some could not remember their own names. The oubliette was not always considered torture in the legal sense. It was considered storage. That distinction says a great deal about the medieval mind. Strappado was the preferred method of the Inquisition across much of southern Europe, and its simplicity was part of what made it so widely adopted. The victim's hands were tied behind their back. A rope was attached to the bound wrists and passed over a beam or pulley above. Then the person was lifted off the ground entirely, suspended by their arms twisted behind them. The shoulders, not designed to bear weight from that angle, dislocated. In its basic form, this was enough to produce confessions from most people within minutes. In the more severe version, called squassation, weights were tied to the feet. The person was lifted high and then dropped, stopped just before hitting the floor. The sudden jerk through already destroyed joints caused damage that no medieval medicine could repair. Survivors of squassation typically lost full use of their arms permanently. And yet, because the skin remained unbroken and the wounds were internal, courts considered it a relatively moderate form of questioning. The legal term used in some Italian documents was the question with some sharpness. A phrase so calm, it is almost more disturbing than any description of the act itself. The burning of feet over hot coals was documented in courts and military tribunals across northern and central Europe as far back as the early medieval period. The method required nothing elaborate: a fire, a pair of restraints, and patience. The victim was immobilized completely, and their bare feet positioned near the heat source. What made this technique valued was its controllability. The interrogator could increase or decrease the intensity simply by adjusting the distance. They could pause when a question was asked and let the heat build again during the silence that followed. Some accounts from German ecclesiastical courts describe the addition of fat or salt to the feet before the session began, which intensified the burning and made the sensations spread more evenly across the soul. It was a method that required no special tools, no expensive materials, and no particular training. which is perhaps why it appears so consistently in the records of small towns and rural courts that could not afford more elaborate instruments. Water torture. In a form remarkably similar to modern waterboarding, appears in Italian legal documents from the 14th century and in Spanish Inquisition records throughout the 15th. The procedure was straightforward. The person was restrained on a flat surface, tilted so that the head was lower than the feet. A cloth was placed over the face. Water was poured. The sensation produced was immediate and overwhelming, a complete and involuntary conviction of drowning, even though no drowning was occurring. The person could be brought to the edge of unconsciousness and then allowed to recover, only for the process to begin again. What medieval courts valued about this method, and what their written records say explicitly, was that it left no marks. The body was undamaged. The suffering was total. The legal distinction between those two facts was, to the medieval legal mind, a meaningful and important one. The Judas cradle looked almost like furniture, a tall wooden stand supporting a seat in the shape of a pyramid with the point facing upward. The victim was undressed, lifted by ropes, positioned above the pyramid, and slowly lowered. The full weight of the body settled onto the point. No additional force was applied. The device required none. The person was left in that position, unable to sleep, unable to shift their weight, unable to find any angle in which the pressure was reduced. Sessions on the Judas cradle were often conducted through the night, with the torturers sleeping in rotation nearby. It was used extensively in the Spanish and Italian Inquisition, and appears in numerous tribunal records as an instrument of preliminary questioning, meaning it was used before more severe methods to soften a person's resistance before the real interrogation began. The absence of sleep, combined with constant pain, typically produced the desired results within 1 or 2 nights. The scavenger's daughter worked on the opposite principle from the rack. Where the rack pulled the body apart, the scavenger's daughter folded it together. It was an iron hoop that forced the victim into a tight crouch, head pressed toward knees, arms locked against the body. The compression was total. Blood was forced toward the extremities. The chest was under constant pressure, making each breath a conscious and painful act. Extended sessions caused hemorrhaging from the nose, the ears, and sometimes the mouth. It was developed in England during the Tudor period and named, according to contemporary accounts, after its inventor. It required no fire, no water, no ropes. It was a single iron object that, when closed around a human body, became something else entirely. Sleep deprivation, as a deliberate and systematic method of breaking a person's mental resistance, was understood and practiced in the medieval period, long before modern psychology gave it a clinical name. The method was simple. The prisoner was kept awake by any means necessary. Guards worked in shifts, waking the person every time they drifted off. Some accounts describe prisoners being kept standing, tied to a wall at a height that prevented them from relaxing their legs. Others describe the use of noise, dripping water, the presence of light in a room that was otherwise dark. After 3 days without sleep, the average person begins to experience symptoms that medieval observers described, without fully understanding what they were seeing, as a kind of madness. Perceptions distort. Memory fractures. The boundary between what is real and what is imagined begins to dissolve. Confessions obtained after prolonged sleep deprivation were considered entirely valid in most medieval courts and were recorded alongside those obtained by physical means, with no distinction made between them. The pillory and the stocks were so common in medieval towns as to be considered part of the ordinary furniture of public life. Every market square of any size had them. They were not, in the legal sense, torture instruments. They were punishment devices. But the distinction collapsed quickly in practice. A person locked into the pillory, head and hands fixed in the wooden frame, was entirely at the mercy of whoever happened to be passing. The court that sentenced a person to the pillory knew this. The sentence was not simply confinement. It was exposure. The community was implicitly invited to participate. Rocks, rotten food, and human waste were thrown. Ears were sometimes nailed to the wood. In winter, the exposure alone could be fatal. The pillory turned punishment into a public event, and the public into an instrument of that punishment. It was cheap, visible, and required no specialist to operate, which made it, in many ways, the most democratic form of medieval suffering. Pressing, known in legal records as peine forte et dure, which translates roughly as strong and hard punishment, was used in English courts for a specific and unusual purpose. It was not applied to extract a confession. It was applied to force a person to enter a plea. Under English law, a trial could not proceed without the accused formally saying either guilty or not guilty. Some defendants, understanding that a conviction would mean the forfeiture of all their property to the Crown, chose instead to say nothing at all. If they died without being convicted, their families kept everything. The court's response to this strategy was to have the silent defendant laid on the stone floor of the prison, a board placed on their chest, and heavy stones loaded onto the board one by one. The process could continue for days. The defendant was given minimal water and no food. They could stop it at any moment by speaking a single word. Some never did. The most famous case in English records is that of Giles Corey, pressed to death in 1692, who reportedly responded to each new stone only by asking for more weight. Branding was among the oldest and most universal forms of physical punishment in the medieval world, practiced in every region of Europe and documented in records stretching back to the earliest centuries of the period. A metal implement, usually shaped into a letter or symbol corresponding to the crime, was heated in fire until it glowed and then pressed against the skin of the convicted person. The face, the hand, the shoulder, and the forehead were the most common sights. The purpose was not primarily pain, though the pain was severe. The purpose was permanent identification. A branded person carried their crime on their body for the rest of their life. Every innkeeper who saw their hand, every merchant who noticed their cheek, every stranger they met on a road would know instantly what they had been convicted of. In a world without photographs or written records accessible to ordinary people, the branded body was its own document, its own public record, impossible to falsify and impossible to hide. Mutilation as judicial punishment was not considered torture in the medieval legal framework. It was considered proportional justice. The doctrine of an eye for an eye was not merely a metaphor, it was policy. A thief's hand was removed. A perjurer's tongue was cut out. A forger who had used their fingers to produce false documents lost those fingers. The logic was consistent within its own framework. The part of the body that had committed the crime was made to answer for it. What we now understand about infection about the medieval absence of anything resembling sterile technique, about the mortality rates following even relatively minor surgical procedures, tells us that many of these sentences were effectively death sentences delivered slowly. A hand removed in the town square with an unsterilized blade in the 12th century was the beginning of a process that frequently ended in death by infection within days or weeks. The court recorded a sentence of mutilation. What it delivered, often, was something else. The tongue tear, sometimes recorded in court documents as the removal of the tongue for the crime of blasphemy or heresy, was carried out with a specialized iron instrument designed to grip and extract the tongue from the mouth of a conscious person. It was used across Europe, but appears most frequently in the records of ecclesiastical courts dealing with cases of public religious offense. The irony built into this punishment was deliberate and noted by the courts that ordered it. The instrument of the sin was the instrument of its punishment. The person who had spoken against God or against the Church was silenced by the removal of the very thing they had used to offend. What records do not capture, because the people who experienced it could no longer speak afterward, is what life looked like for those who survived. Eating, drinking, communicating, every basic function of daily existence transformed permanently by a single session in a court that no longer required their voice for anything at all. The world of medieval torture did not stand still. It evolved. The instruments grew more specialized, more deliberate, more precisely engineered toward a single purpose. What began in the early medieval period as relatively improvised methods of causing pain gradually became, by the High and Late Middle Ages, a sophisticated catalogue of devices, each designed with a specific intention, each carrying its own history of use across the courts and dungeons of Europe. The transition from the basic methods we have already explored into the darker, more elaborate instruments that followed was not sudden. It happened gradually, across generations, as craftsmen and court officials and inquisitors compared notes, shared techniques, and refined their approaches with the same patient attention that other medieval craftsmen applied to the making of cathedrals or the forging of swords. The Iron Maiden is perhaps the most famous torture device in all of popular history, and it comes with a significant complication. Most historians today believe that the classic Iron Maiden, the human-shaped iron cabinet lined with interior spikes that would impale anyone locked inside, was largely a myth, or at least a dramatic exaggeration assembled from fragments of other real devices. The most famous example, displayed for centuries in the Nuremberg Museum, was almost certainly constructed in the early 19th century from unrelated medieval iron pieces assembled together to satisfy the appetite of paying tourists. However, the idea behind it was not entirely invented. Enclosure devices that caused pain through confinement and pressure were real and documented. Spiked collars that prevented sleep by stabbing the wearer if they lowered their head were real. The Iron Maiden as a single iconic object is largely a story we told ourselves about the Middle Ages. But the impulse it represents, enclosing a human body in something designed to cause harm, was entirely genuine. The Spanish boot, by contrast, was entirely real and extensively documented in the records of both secular and ecclesiastical courts across Spain, Scotland, France, and Germany. It was a boot or encasing device made of iron or wood that was fitted around the lower leg and foot. Once in place, Wedges were driven into it with a mallet, compressing the flesh and bone with steadily increasing force. The bones of the foot and ankle, some of the most complex and delicate structures in the human body, were crushed progressively with each blow of the mallet. Court records from Scottish witch trials of the 16th and 17th centuries, which drew heavily on medieval precedent, describe the Spanish boot being applied multiple times to the same victims across separate sessions. A man named John Fian, accused of witchcraft in 1590, had his legs crushed so severely in the boot that, according to the official court record, the blood and marrow spurted forth in great abundance. He confessed. He later recanted. He was tortured again. He died without ever being released. The Catherine wheel, also known simply as the breaking wheel, stands as one of the most theatrical and deliberately public instruments of medieval punishment. It was exactly what its name suggests: a large wooden wheel, similar to those used on carts and wagons, but repurposed into an instrument of execution and torture. The condemned person was spread-eagled on the ground, and their limbs were broken methodically with a heavy iron-shod wheel or with a hammer, following a sequence that courts sometimes specified in advance. A sentence of breaking from the bottom up meant the legs were destroyed first, then the arms, and death came slowly. Breaking from the top down was considered more merciful, as the blows delivered to the chest and head brought death more quickly. The broken body was then typically tied to the wheel itself, and the wheel was raised on a pole and left standing in a public place, sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks, as a visible statement to everyone who passed about what the court was willing to do and what it expected from those who lived under its authority. The pair of anguish appears in historical records and in museum collections, and its existence, unlike the Iron Maiden, is not seriously disputed by historians. It was a pear-shaped metal device divided into segments that could be expanded by turning a screw. It was designed to be inserted into the mouth, and its expansion forced the jaw open to a degree that caused dislocation and severe tearing of the soft tissue. Variants designed for other orifices are described in several period documents, particularly in the context of crimes that the Church considered offences against nature. What made the pair of anguish particularly notable in the historical record is the way it was used not only as a means of causing pain, but as a means of preventing speech. A person with the device locked inside their mouth could not speak, could not beg, could not call out, could not confess. In that configuration, it was used not as an interrogation tool, but as a silencing one, applied to those being transported through public spaces who might otherwise make statements that the authorities preferred not to have heard. The thumbscrew was smaller and cheaper than most other torture devices, which contributed to its extraordinary geographical spread. It required no room, no fire, no water, no elaborate frame. It was a portable instrument, small enough to fit in a coat pocket, that could be carried by a travelling inquisitor or court official and applied wherever a session was needed. Two metal plates with a screw mechanism between them were placed around the thumbs, or sometimes around all the fingers simultaneously, and the screw was tightened. The bones of the fingers, like those of the feet, are numerous and relatively fragile, and the pain produced by their compression was immediate and severe. Scottish court records are particularly rich with references to the thumbscrew, which they called the pilnywinks, and its use appears in cases ranging from accusations of witchcraft to straightforward criminal interrogations. It was still in documented use in parts of Europe well into the 17th century, long after more elaborate devices had fallen out of official favour. The heretic's fork was a double-ended iron implement with a cluster of prongs at each end. It was suspended from the neck by a collar and positioned so that one set of prongs rested under the chin and the other against the upper chest. As long as the wearer held their head upright, the prongs did not penetrate the skin. The moment their head dropped forward, which it inevitably did when exhaustion set in, the prongs of both ends pressed into flesh. It did not kill. It did not produce the dramatic visible damage of the rack or the breaking wheel. What it did was prevent rest while constantly threatening harm, creating a condition in which the body's own need for sleep became the source of its suffering. It was used in continental Europe and appears most frequently in the context of prolonged interrogations, particularly of those accused of heresy, where courts wanted to maintain pressure over days rather than hours without committing to the more severe physical damage that would result from other instruments. Now it is worth pausing here and following one documented case in detail, because the accumulated list of instruments and methods only tells part of the story. The experience of a real person inside this system tells another part entirely. In 1468, in the city of Arras, in what is now northern France, a series of accusations of witchcraft and diabolism swept through the city's population with a speed and ferocity that contemporaries found alarming even by the standards of the time. The episode became known as the Vauderie d'Arras, and it began, as many such cases did, with a single confession extracted under torture from a man named Jehan Lavitte, a poor painter accused of attending Sabbaths and consorting with the devil. Under questioning that included strappado and the application of hot coals, Lavitte named names. Each person he named was arrested. Each arrested person was subjected to the same methods. Each named more people. Within months, dozens of citizens of Arras had been arrested, tortured, and in several cases executed. The accused included not just the poor and the marginal, but wealthy merchants, respected clergy, and members of the local nobility. The terror spread because the system was designed in a way that made it spread. A person under sufficient pain will say whatever they believe their questioner wants to hear. And what the inquisitors of Arras wanted to hear were more names. The episode ended eventually, not because the courts ran out of accused, but because enough powerful people had been implicated that the authorities in Paris intervened. Many of those convicted were posthumously rehabilitated years later. The painter Jehan Lavitte, whose tortured words had started everything, did not live to see it. The cage, known in some records as the Little Ease, was a confinement device calibrated with unusual precision to the dimensions of the human body. It was made just large enough that the person inside could not stand, could not sit fully upright, and could not lie down. Every position available was a position of partial strain. The muscles could never fully relax. Sleep in any meaningful sense was impossible for more than a few minutes at a time. The Tower of London had a cell called Little Ease that was used for high-profile prisoners and is mentioned in records from the Tudor period, though the design itself is considerably older. The cruelty of the cage was in its mathematical exactness. It was not a room that happened to be small. It was a space engineered to deny rest. Whoever designed it had thought carefully about the average dimensions of a human body, and had created something that exploited those dimensions as precisely as any other medieval instrument exploited the vulnerabilities of specific joints or nerve endings. The use of animals in torture is documented in medieval records with less frequency than mechanical devices, but with a vividness that makes the accounts impossible to set aside. Rats were the most commonly referenced animal, and their use followed a consistent pattern across the accounts that survive. A metal container, open at one end, was filled with rats, and the open end placed against the naked skin of a restrained person, usually the abdomen or chest. The container was then heated from the outside. With no other exit available, the rats did what frightened animals do. What makes these accounts particularly significant historically is not their frequency, which was relatively low, but the psychological dimension they introduced. The threat of the rats, the sound of them inside the container before the heat was applied, produced confessions in many cases before any physical contact occurred at all. The imagination, the medieval interrogators had learned, was sometimes a more effective instrument than any device of iron or wood. Forced posture, distinct from the formal strappado but related to it, was a method used in interrogations across Europe that left almost no physical evidence and required no equipment beyond a room and a guard. The accused was required to stand, arms raised, or to kneel on a hard stone floor without moving for hours at a time. Movement was punished with blows. The sustained muscular strain of maintaining any unnatural position for long enough crosses from discomfort into genuine agony within a matter of hours and into a kind of systemic physical breakdown within a day or two. Medieval court records rarely describe this method in detail, which is itself a historical clue. Methods that left no marks and required no special tools tended to be under-recorded precisely because there was less to describe. Their absence from the formal record does not mean their absence from the cells. Hot pincers, called brodequins in some French documents, represented the intersection of the blacksmith's craft and the torturer's practice. They were iron implements that could be heated in a fire until they glowed and then applied to the skin, the tongue, the fingers, or any other part of the body that an interrogator chose to target. The burns produced were severe and permanent. Unlike the controlled heat of the foot-burning method described earlier, hot pincers could be applied with precision to specific locations, guided by whatever information the interrogator was trying to extract. The loss of a nipple, a finger, or a section of the tongue to hot pincers was not an accident of the process. It was its outcome, deliberately, specifically, and with the full written authorization of the court that had ordered the session to begin. The wooden horse was a device used in military contexts as well as in formal judicial settings, and its design was almost contemptuous in its simplicity. It was a wooden beam set on legs with the upper edge sharpened into a ridge. The victim was made to sit astride this ridge with their full body weight pressing downward onto the sharp edge. Weights were attached to the feet to increase the force. It required no mechanism, no fire, no water, just wood, weight, and time. It was used in garrison prisons and military courts across Europe and appears in colonial American records as well, carried there by European settlers who brought their judicial traditions with them across the Atlantic. The wooden horse was so simple and so portable that it appears in contexts where formal torture chambers did not exist. In fields, in ships, in temporary military encampments, wherever there was a beam of wood and a question that needed answering. By the time the medieval period reached its middle centuries, torture had become something more than a legal instrument. It had become a theology. The Church, which in the early centuries of Christianity had explicitly condemned the use of pain to extract confession, had by the 12th and 13th centuries arrived at a very different position. The transformation was gradual, driven by the growing anxiety of an institution that felt itself surrounded by enemies, by heretics who questioned its doctrines, by communities that practiced old beliefs in new disguises, by individuals whose inner lives could not be inspected or controlled through ordinary means. If the soul was at stake, the Church reasoned, then the body was a small price to pay for its salvation. A person who confessed under torture and received absolution was, in this framework, better off than one who died in silent heresy. The pain was temporary, the soul was eternal. And so, the Inquisition was born, and with it a new chapter in the history of human suffering that was distinguished from what came before not by its cruelty alone, but by the extraordinary sophistication of its organization. The Inquisition was not a single institution. It was a family of institutions, operating at different times and in different places across Europe, sharing a common theological purpose, but varying considerably in their procedures and their methods. The medieval Inquisition, established in the 13th century to address the spread of Catharism in southern France and northern Italy, was in many ways the template from which the others were drawn. The Spanish Inquisition, founded in 1478 under Ferdinand and Isabella, was the most systematically organized and the most extensively documented. The Roman Inquisition, established in 1542, operated well into the modern period. Together, they created a body of procedural literature, manuals, guides, and legal frameworks for the conduct of interrogation that represents one of the most detailed records of institutional torture that history has preserved. The manual, known as the Malleus Maleficarum, published in 1487 by the Dominican inquisitors Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, became the most widely consulted guide to the identification, interrogation, and prosecution of witches in the late medieval and early modern periods. It went through numerous editions and was read by judges, inquisitors, and local magistrates across Europe for more than a century. What the Malleus contributed to the practice of torture was not new instruments, but a new systematic psychology of the accused. It described in detail how witches might resist confession, what signs to look for that indicated demonic assistance in maintaining silence, and how to counter that resistance through a carefully sequenced escalation of pressure. It treated the interrogation of a suspected witch not as a legal procedure, but as a spiritual battle, and it gave inquisitors the theological confidence to push further than secular courts typically permitted. The Malleus did not create the witch trials, but it gave them a language, a structure, and a sense of divine authorization that made them far more lethal than they would otherwise have been. Imagine for a moment that you are a woman living in a small German town in the year 1490. You are perhaps 40 years old. Your neighbor's child has fallen ill. Your neighbor, in her grief and her fear, remembers that you argued with her last month over a fence line. She tells someone, that someone tells someone else. A word is used. A question is asked. And then one morning there is a knock at your door, and the men who stand outside it are not neighbors. They are officials and they have a document. From that moment forward, the world you knew ceases to exist. You are taken to a place you have never been. You are asked questions you do not understand how to answer. And behind those questions, visible and patient, are the instruments we have already described and the ones we are about to encounter. This was not a rare experience. It was the experience of tens of thousands of people across Europe between the 13th and the 17th centuries. Most of them were women. Most of them were not wealthy. Almost none of them had any meaningful way to defend themselves against what was coming. Sleep deprivation as a formal inquisitorial technique was refined by church tribunals into something considerably more systematic than the improvised methods used by secular courts. The Inquisition's preferred term was the vigilia, the watching, and it was applied specifically to suspects who had resisted other methods of questioning. The accused was kept awake continuously, with teams of guards rotating through the night to ensure that no sleep occurred. This was combined with a technique called the territorial examination, in which the inquisitor would question the accused at irregular intervals throughout the night and the following day, never allowing them to predict when the next session would begin or how long it would last. The psychological effect of this unpredictability was well understood by experienced inquisitors, even if they could not explain it in the terms that modern neuroscience would use. A mind that cannot rest and cannot predict becomes a mind that cannot protect itself. Confessions obtained after 48 or 72 hours of continuous waking were considered among the most reliable available to the Inquisition's courts. The swimming test, or trial by water, occupied a strange position in medieval practice because it was not, strictly speaking, sanctioned by the formal church courts. It was a folk method, deeply rooted in older Germanic and Anglo-Saxon legal traditions that persisted in popular use long after ecclesiastical authorities had officially condemned it. The logic behind it was theological rather than practical. Water, as the medium of baptism, was considered incapable of accepting the guilty. A person thrown into a body of water and found to float was therefore rejected by the water and guilty. A person who sank was innocent, though often dead before this verdict could be acted upon. The method was used most persistently in witchcraft accusations, where it intersected with the formal Inquisition process in complex ways. Local communities often conducted their own swimming tests before formal accusation, presenting the results to inquisitorial or secular courts as evidence. The courts that received this evidence occupied an awkward position, officially skeptical of the method's validity, but often practically willing to treat its results as at least suggestive. The use of prolonged fasting as a coercive technique was documented in Inquisition records from both Spain and Italy, typically applied in combination with other methods rather than alone. The accused was simply not fed, or was fed only enough to sustain consciousness while interrogation continued. The physical effects of sustained starvation begin within days and become severe within a week, with weakness, disorientation, and an increasing inability to maintain complex thought processes, making sustained resistance progressively more difficult. What makes this method historically interesting is how it was recorded. Inquisition documents that describe the application of the rack or strappado use specific technical language and are clearly describing deliberate procedures. Documents that describe a prisoner receiving inadequate food, tend to frame it as an administrative matter, a shortage, a logistical difficulty, rather than as a deliberate strategy. The gap between what those documents say and what they describe is itself a kind of historical evidence about how the people running these institutions thought about what they were doing and how they wanted it to be remembered. The ordeal of cold water was a precursor to and parallel development alongside the swimming test, and operated on similar theological principles, but in a more formalized legal context. It was one of several ordeals that early medieval law recognized as legitimate means of determining guilt or innocence through divine intervention. The accused was submerged in cold water, sometimes blessed water, and the result was interpreted as the judgment of God. The ordeal of hot water required the accused to plunge their hand into boiling liquid and retrieve an object from the bottom. The wound was then bandaged and examined after a set number of days. A clean healing was taken as evidence of innocence. A wound that festered was taken as evidence of guilt. The Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 officially prohibited clergy from participating in trials by ordeal, effectively ending their use in formal ecclesiastical courts. But the practices persisted in folk and secular contexts long after this official prohibition, demonstrating the gap that consistently existed between what church authorities declared and what actually happened in the towns and villages of medieval Europe. Confession under torture was considered legally valid in most medieval jurisdictions, with one important condition. It had to be confirmed freely the following day without torture being applied. This confirmation requirement was intended as a safeguard, a mechanism to ensure that what had been said under duress was genuinely true. In practice, it functioned quite differently. A person who had just survived a session on the rack or the strappado, and who understood clearly that a failure to confirm their confession would result in a return to those same instruments, was not, in any meaningful sense, confirming freely. They were confirming under the continuing threat of what had already happened to them. Inquisitors and secular courts were aware of this dynamic. Some records show inquisitors explicitly reminding the accused, during the confirmation session, of the instruments that remained available should the confession be withdrawn. The safeguard existed on paper. In the room where confirmations were given, it existed rather less reliably. The crime of heresy was unique in medieval law because it was, by definition, a crime of the interior. A person could be a heretic without doing anything visible, without committing any observable act. The heresy lived in what they believed, in the private contents of a mind that no external examination could directly access. This created a fundamental problem for the courts that prosecuted it, and made torture not merely useful, but, within the logic of the system, almost inevitable. If the crime was interior, then only the accused could provide evidence of its existence. And if the accused was unwilling to provide that evidence voluntarily, then the only tool available to the court was the application of sufficient pressure to make the interior visible. The philosophical circularity of this position, in which the method of proof was itself the method of producing the crime's evidence, was noted by some critics even within the medieval church. But criticism rarely translated into change. The system was too useful, too deeply embedded in too many institutions, and backed by too much accumulated precedent for philosophical objections to dismantle it. Solitary confinement, applied for months or years rather than days, was used by Inquisition courts in a way that distinguished it from the simple dungeon confinement of secular courts. The Inquisition's version was designed with the accused's psychological state in mind in a way that secular dungeons typically were not. The prisoner was isolated completely from anyone they knew. They were permitted no communication with family, no word of what was happening in the world outside, no information about how their case was progressing or what had happened to others who had been arrested alongside them. They were, however, occasionally visited by inquisitors who would ask questions, offer vague suggestions of mercy, and then withdraw without making any concrete promises. This pattern of isolation, broken only by interrogation, created a psychological dependency that experienced inquisitors understood well. The inquisitor became the accused's only human contact, the only source of information, the only possible avenue toward an end to the confinement. In that dynamic, the power differential between questioner and questioned reached its most extreme expression, and the confession, when it came, often came not from a broken body, but from a broken relationship with the possibility of any other human connection at all. The denunciation system that fed the Inquisition's caseload was itself a form of social torture, operating not in a chamber, but across entire communities. Any person could denounce any other person to the Inquisition. The identity of the denouncer was kept secret from the accused. There was no mechanism by which an accused person could confront their accuser, question their motives, or challenge the reliability of what they had said. The accused was presented with charges and asked to respond to them without being told where those charges came from. In communities where the Inquisition was active, this secrecy created an atmosphere of universal suspicion. Neighbors watched neighbors. Families watched each other. The knowledge that anyone might have spoken to the inquisitors, or might in the future, altered the texture of daily life in ways that extended the reach of the institution far beyond the walls of any physical chamber. People self-censored. They avoided certain conversations. They were careful about what they said in church, at the market, in their own homes. The Inquisition's power to cause suffering was at its greatest, not in its dungeons, but in the minds of the people who had never been arrested and hoped never to be. The recantation and relapse cycle was one of the most brutal features of the inquisitorial process for those who became caught in it. A person accused of heresy who confessed and expressed genuine repentance could, in theory, be reconciled to the Church through a public ceremony of penance and returned to ordinary life, typically with significant conditions attached, such as the wearing of a distinctive garment, attendance at specified religious observances, and the permanent obligation to report any heretical activity they became aware of. This outcome was considered merciful. However, a person who had been reconciled and was subsequently accused again, or who was found to have not fully abandoned the beliefs they had confessed to holding, was classified as a relapsed heretic, and the penalty for relapse was death. There was no further opportunity for reconciliation. The Church had already offered its mercy once. A relapsed heretic was handed over to the secular authorities with a formal request for lenient treatment, which was a legal formula both parties understood to mean execution by burning. The gap between the official language of mercy and the practical reality of what relapse meant is one of the clearest illustrations available of how the Inquisition used procedural formality as a cover for outcomes that its own stated values should have made impossible. The preparation of the accused before a formal torture session was itself a ritualized procedure in many Inquisition courts, particularly in Spain. The accused was brought to the torture chamber and shown the instruments. They were described in detail. The procedure that would follow was explained clearly and without apparent emotion by the inquisitor or their assistant. The accused was then given a final opportunity to confess without the instruments being applied. This preview of what was coming served several purposes simultaneously. It was, officially, a demonstration of the court's reluctance to cause harm and its preference for voluntary confession. In practice, it was also a highly effective psychological technique. The sight of the rack, the smell of the fire, the sound of the mechanisms being tested by the technicians present in the room, all of this produced in many accused persons a level of terror sufficient to extract a confession before a single procedure began. The official record of such sessions would note that confession had been given before torture was applied, which was technically accurate and practically meaningless in equal measure. The documentation of torture sessions by the Inquisition was extraordinarily thorough, and it is this thoroughness that has given historians their most detailed window into what these procedures actually looked like from the inside. A designated notary was present at every formal session. Their job was to transcribe everything that was said by the inquisitor and by the accused in real time. These transcripts include not only questions and answers, but physical descriptions of what was happening to the accused while they were speaking. The phrase, "and at this point the subject cried out," appears with a regularity that becomes, after enough pages, almost unbearable to read. The subject said they knew nothing, and the rope was tightened. The subject begged for mercy, and the inquisitor asked again. The subject lost consciousness briefly and was revived with water before questioning resumed. These documents were not created as records of suffering. They were created as legal evidence of procedure, proof that the rules had been followed and the confession properly obtained. What they accidentally preserved was something else. The voice, fragmented and desperate and real, of people living through one of the worst experiences a human being can endure. That these voices survived at all, buried in the archives of the institutions that silenced them, is one of the stranger and more unsettling gifts that history has left us. There is a moment in the history of medieval punishment where the darkness moves from the private chamber into the open air, where the dungeon door swings open and the suffering, which had until now been conducted in stone rooms beneath the ground, steps out into the sunlight, into the town square, onto the scaffold, in front of the crowd. This transition from private torture to public execution was not simply a change of location. It was a change of purpose, a change of audience, and a change of meaning. Private torture was about information. It was about extracting confession, producing evidence, breaking the resistance of an individual. Public punishment was about something else entirely. It was about the community, about the message, about the demonstration, staged with theatrical precision, of what power looked like and what it was capable of doing to those who defied it. The scaffold was not just a place of death, it was a stage. And the execution was not just a killing, it was a performance, carefully designed to be remembered by everyone who witnessed it and repeated in conversation long after the crowd had gone home. The gallows were the most common instrument of public execution in medieval Europe, and their presence in towns and cities was so normalized as to be almost unremarkable. Permanent gallows structures stood at the edges of most significant medieval settlements, visible from the roads that led into town so that travelers approaching from any direction would see them before they saw anything else. This placement was deliberate. The gallows were a greeting, a statement of municipal authority addressed to everyone who arrived. The act of hanging itself, in its medieval form, was not the swift death produced by the long drop method developed in the 19th century. Medieval hanging used a short rope and a ladder or a cart that was pulled away beneath the condemned person's feet. Death came by slow strangulation, which could take many minutes. The person remained conscious for much of this process. Families of the condemned were sometimes permitted to pull on the legs to hasten death, an act of mercy performed in public that captures in a single image the texture of medieval execution culture. Its combination of sanctioned violence, communal participation, and the strange persistence of human tenderness, even in the most extreme circumstances. Drawing and quartering, known formally as being hanged, drawn and quartered, was reserved in England for the crime of high treason, and its procedural complexity reflected the severity with which that crime was regarded. The condemned person was first dragged through the streets on a hurdle, a wooden frame, to the place of execution. This dragging, the drawing of the sentence's name, was itself a punishment, subjecting the person to the physical abuse of the journey and the psychological experience of being displayed to the crowds that lined the route. They were then hanged by the neck, but cut down while still alive. The subsequent procedures, which included the removal of the entrails and their burning while the condemned watched, the beheading, and the division of the body into 4 parts for display in different locations, were intended to ensure that the punishment extended beyond death itself. The body, after execution, could not be buried whole, could not be mourned normally, could not, in the theological understanding of the time, be easily resurrected. The destruction of the body was a theological as well as a physical statement, an attempt to extend the reach of earthly punishment into the territory of the eternal. William Wallace, the Scottish knight whose resistance to English rule made him the most celebrated rebel of his generation, was executed in London in August of 1305, following his capture and trial for treason. His trial lasted approximately 1 day. He was not permitted to speak in his own defense in any meaningful sense. The verdict was predetermined. What followed was one of the most extensively documented executions of the medieval period, and one that followed the full procedure of hanging, drawing, and quartering with careful and deliberate thoroughness. Wallace was dragged through the streets of London on a hurdle from Westminster to Smithfield, a distance of several miles, before crowds that had gathered specifically to witness the event. He was hanged, cut down alive, emasculated, disemboweled, his entrails burned before him, beheaded, and his body divided into 4 parts. His head was placed on London Bridge. His limbs were sent to Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth, each a town associated with his rebellion, each receiving its portion of him as a warning. The English crown intended the execution of Wallace to end Scottish resistance. It produced, instead, a martyr whose story has not stopped being told in the 7 centuries since his death. Burning at the stake was the preferred method of execution for those convicted of heresy by the Inquisition, and its use was carefully framed in theological language that attempted to separate the church from the act of killing. The church officially did not execute anyone. What it did was declare a person a heretic, exhaust every available means of securing their repentance, and then, in cases where repentance was not forthcoming or was judged to be insincere, hand the condemned person over to the secular authorities with a formal request for mercy. The secular authorities understood that this request was not a request. It was a direction. The burning that followed was technically a secular act performed by secular officials on secular ground. This legal fiction allowed the Church to maintain its official position that it did not shed blood while presiding over an institution whose activities resulted in the deaths of thousands of people across several centuries. The burning itself was designed to be witnessed. Large fires were built in public squares. The condemned was chained to a stake at the center. In cases where the court wished to show some degree of mercy, a bag of gunpowder was sometimes tied around the condemned person's neck so that the fire would reach it quickly and end their suffering relatively fast. In cases where no such mercy was intended, the fire was built in a way that ensured a slow death. Contemporary accounts of burnings describe the crowds that attended them, the sounds they produced, and the smells, in language of a directness that is difficult to read, even at a distance of 5 or 6 centuries. Joan of Arc was 19 years old when she was burned at the stake in the marketplace of Rouen on the 30th of May, 1431. She had been captured by Burgundian forces the previous year, sold to the English, and subjected to a trial conducted by a church court under the presidency of Pierre Cauchon, the Bishop of Beauvais, who had significant political reasons to want a conviction. The trial lasted several months and involved dozens of sessions in which Joan was questioned about her visions, her voices, her refusal to wear women's clothing, and her claim to have acted under divine instruction. She was not permitted legal counsel. She had no advocate. She was questioned by professional theologians whose purpose was not to discover the truth, but to construct a case. Under the sustained psychological pressure of those months of interrogation, she eventually signed a document of abjuration recanting her claims. She was sentenced to life imprisonment. Days later, she retracted her recantation, reportedly because she had been denied the church attendance and the women's clothing she had been promised in exchange for signing. She was immediately declared a relapsed heretic. The sentence was death by fire. At the stake, she asked for a cross to be held before her eyes. An English soldier made one from 2 sticks and gave it to her. She died holding it. 25 years later, a posthumous retrial declared her innocent of all charges. In 1920, she was canonized as a saint by the same church whose court had burned her. The breaking wheel as an instrument of prolonged public death was used most extensively in France and Germany, and the sentences delivered by courts sometimes specified the exact sequence and number of blows, with a care that reveals how thoroughly the punishment had been formalized into a ritual. A sentence might specify that the condemned was to receive a certain number of blows from the bottom up, meaning beginning with the ankles and working upward through the body to maximize the duration of conscious suffering. The broken person was then typically woven through the spokes of the wheel, and the wheel was raised on a pole. Death from exposure and the injuries sustained could take hours or even days. During this time, the person remained visible to the public and accessible to those who wished to approach. Some accounts describe clergy attending the dying person on the wheel to offer last rites. Others describe family members bringing water. The wheel thus became a site of protracted dying that the community was required to witness and to which it contributed, in ways ranging from cruelty to compassion, a participation that the authorities who ordered these sentences understood to be part of their function. Beheading was considered across most of medieval Europe to be the most honorable form of execution, and its application was therefore largely restricted to the nobility. The logic was social and symbolic simultaneously. A beheading, when performed competently, was swift. It did not involve the prolonged suffering of hanging or the theatrical destruction of drawing and quartering. It treated the condemned body with a relative dignity that other methods did not. For a nobleman or a knight to be hanged would have been a double punishment, the loss of life compounded by the loss of social standing that the manner of death implied. For a commoner to be beheaded was sometimes interpreted as a deliberate act of elevation, a final acknowledgement of some quality that had distinguished them from others of their station. The axe or sword required skill. A botched beheading, in which multiple blows were required, was considered a failure of the executioner and a cause for public complaint. Records of such failures exist across the medieval period, including accounts of executioners being jeered or attacked by crowds who felt that the condemned had not been given the clean death their sentence implied. Public flogging occupied the space between the more extreme punishments and the lighter penalties of the pillory or the fine. It was applied across the full social spectrum to men, women, children, clergy, and laity, and it was carried out in public specifically because the visibility of the punishment was considered part of its effect on the community, rather than simply on the individual being punished. The instrument used varied by region and by the severity of the sentence. A leather strap, a bundle of birch rods, a knotted rope, a cat of 9 tails in its earlier forms, each produced a different quality of wound and a different duration of pain. Some sentences specified the number of strokes. Others specified that the flogging should continue until a certain quantity of blood had been shed. Ecclesiastical courts that could not officially shed blood developed their own terminology for flogging, describing it as discipline rather than punishment, the same word used for the penitential self-flagellation practiced voluntarily by monks and religious laypeople. The linguistic overlap between voluntary spiritual practice and involuntary judicial punishment is one of the places where medieval culture's relationship with physical suffering becomes most difficult for a modern reader to fully comprehend. Mutilation as public punishment differed from the private mutilations carried out in interrogation chambers in one essential respect: it was staged. The removal of a hand or a tongue in a public square was not merely the application of a sentence. It was an announcement. An ear nailed to a post and left there for days told everyone who passed what the ear's owner had done and what the court had decided. A person walking through a medieval town with the visible marks of judicial mutilation on their body was a living document of the law's reach and the court's willingness to use it. They could not hide what had happened to them. They could not move to another town and begin again with no one the wiser. The punishment followed them in the most literal sense possible, written on their body in a language that every person who saw them could read without needing to know how to read at all. The execution of children in the medieval period is one of the most difficult aspects of the era's judicial history to confront directly. The legal age of criminal responsibility varied by jurisdiction, but was generally lower than in any modern legal system. Children of 12, 10, and in some documented cases younger were tried, convicted, and executed for crimes ranging from theft to heresy to murder. The records of these cases are sparse, and the language in which they are written is remarkably consistent in its refusal to acknowledge any distinction between the execution of a child and the execution of an adult. The same procedural language was used. The same legal formulas were applied. Some historians have argued that this consistency reflects not indifference, but a genuinely different conceptual framework, one in which childhood was not understood as the distinct and protected category that modern culture has made it. Others have argued that the absence of distinguishing language in the records is itself a form of institutional indifference, the same mechanism that allowed the torture of pregnant women and the mentally ill when the paperwork required it. Both arguments are probably partially true. Neither makes the records easier to read. The execution of heretics in the Spanish Inquisition reached its most public and ritualized form in the ceremony known as the auto da fe, which translates from Portuguese as act of faith. This ceremony was not, in its formal structure, an execution. It was a religious event, a public demonstration of the Inquisition's work and the Church's authority, at which sentences were announced and various penances were performed. Those condemned to death were handed to the secular arm at the conclusion of the ceremony and executed separately, typically on the same day at a location adjacent to the main event. The auto da fe could last for hours. Crowds gathered from surrounding towns and regions to attend. The condemned were dressed in distinctive garments that indicated the nature of their crime. They were processed through the streets. They were made to listen to sermons. The spectacle was elaborately designed to communicate the Church's power, its mercy toward those who repented, and its absolute authority over those who did not. At the largest auto da fe in recorded history, held in Valladolid in 1559, the proceedings were attended by the Spanish royal family and lasted an entire day. 14 people were burned. The event was considered a success. The execution by pressing that we touched on in our earlier discussion of peine forte et dure deserves to be returned to here in the context of its most documented application, the Salem witch trials of 1692 in colonial Massachusetts. While Salem falls outside the strictly medieval period, it represents the direct transplantation of medieval judicial practices into the early modern world and demonstrates how long these methods persisted beyond the era that created them. Giles Corey was an 80-year-old farmer accused of witchcraft who understood clearly that a conviction would result in the forfeiture of his property and chose instead to refuse to enter a plea. The pressing began on the 11th of September, 1692. He was laid on the ground outside Salem jail. A board was placed on his chest. Stones were loaded onto it. Over the course of 2 days, as more stones were added and the sheriff repeatedly asked him to enter a plea, Corey's only recorded responses were requests for more weight. He died on the 13th of September without having spoken a plea. His property passed to his sons-in-law rather than to the court. His defiance cost him everything, and preserved in its stubborn silence something that the court could not take from him. The display of executed bodies was a practice so standard in medieval Europe that it requires an effort of imagination to fully grasp how thoroughly it transformed the visual landscape of medieval towns and roads. Heads on spikes above city gates, bodies hanging in iron cages at crossroads, limbs nailed to the walls of public buildings. These were not the results of chaos or mob violence. They were the deliberate and considered decisions of courts and municipal authorities, who understood that the dead body continued to serve a judicial function long after the person who had inhabited it ceased to exist. A head displayed above a gate said something to every person who entered the city beneath it. It said that the authority which had placed it there was real, was present, and was capable of doing the same to anyone who gave it sufficient reason. The message required no translation. It did not depend on literacy or on the ability to understand legal Latin or the technicalities of the charge that had produced the conviction. It was addressed to the body before it was addressed to the mind, and the body understood it perfectly. There is a geography to medieval torture that most people never consider. When we think of the dungeons and the chambers and the instruments we have already described, we tend to imagine them as belonging to a single unified world, a generic medieval Europe of stone castles and dark corridors, where the same methods were applied in the same ways by the same kinds of people. The reality was considerably more varied and considerably more interesting than that. Torture in medieval France looked different from torture in medieval Germany. The Spanish Inquisition developed techniques and protocols that had no direct equivalent in the ecclesiastical courts of England. The city-states of northern Italy brought to the practice of judicial coercion the same innovative energy they brought to banking and to art. The methods that developed in Scandinavia were shaped by climate and by a legal culture that had its own distinct roots in Norse tradition. And beneath all of these regional variations, woven through each of them in different proportions, was the influence of local belief, local fear, and the particular texture of local power. To understand medieval torture fully is to understand that it was not one thing. It was many things, adapted to many places, by many different kinds of people, each operating within their own version of the same fundamental conviction that the body could be made to reveal what the mind wished to conceal. France developed some of the most formally documented torture procedures in the medieval world, partly because the French royal bureaucracy was among the most sophisticated in Europe and produced records of extraordinary detail. The question extraordinaire, as formal torture was known in French legal terminology, was divided into two categories that reveal how carefully the system had been thought through. The question ordinaire involved the application of methods considered moderate by contemporary standards, primarily the strappado and variants of binding and compression. The question extraordinaire involved more severe procedures, including the brodequins, the French version of the leg-crushing device that worked on similar principles to the Spanish boot, but with its own regional variations in design and application. What distinguished French practice from that of some neighboring jurisdictions was the degree to which it was embedded in written procedure. Lawyers were involved. Documents were produced at every stage. The accused had at least a nominal right to legal representation, though what that representation could practically achieve against the weight of the court's presumption of guilt was severely limited. The paper trail that French courts left behind is one reason that historians know as much as they do about the day-to-day realities of medieval judicial torture. Not because the French were more cruel than their neighbours, but because they were more bureaucratic about it. Germany produced some of the most elaborate and specifically designed torture instruments of the medieval period. And the city of Nuremberg in particular became associated with a tradition of judicial torture that was distinguished by its engineering sophistication. The iron devices developed in German workshops during the 14th and 15th centuries reflected a culture that brought genuine craft skill to the making of objects designed for suffering. The thumbscrew, in its most refined form, was a German development. The various compression devices applied to limbs and joints in German courts showed a level of mechanical precision that went beyond the relatively crude wooden and rope methods prevalent in earlier centuries. German law also developed a specific doctrine around the gradation of torture that was more explicitly codified than in most other jurisdictions. The concept of escalating pressure, beginning with the showing of instruments, proceeding through increasingly severe applications, and pausing at defined intervals to allow for confession, was written into German legal texts with a specificity that treated the management of pain as a discipline requiring formal study. Some German universities in the late medieval period included instruction in judicial procedure that covered the application of torture as part of their curriculum in law. The torturer, in this framework, was not simply a functionary. He was a specialist, trained in a body of knowledge that had its own texts, its own traditions, and its own standards of practice. The Spanish Inquisition's contribution to the history of torture was less in the invention of new instruments than in the development of a comprehensive system for managing the entire process from accusation through confession and sentencing. The toca, the Spanish term for the water torture technique described in our earlier discussion, was applied in Spanish Inquisition cells with a procedural consistency that is documented in hundreds of surviving case files. The procedure was preceded by a formal warning, recorded in the notary's transcript, in which the inquisitor informed the accused that any harm that came to them during questioning would be their own responsibility, since they had refused to confess voluntarily. This legal formula, which transferred responsibility for the suffering about to be inflicted from the court to the victim, appears so consistently in Spanish Inquisition records that it clearly functioned as a standardized script, spoken from memory by inquisitors who had delivered it dozens of times before and would deliver it dozens of times again. The garrucha, the Spanish term for strapado, was applied with similar procedural consistency. What the Spanish Inquisition created across the 2 centuries of its most intensive activity was not simply a body of cases, but a methodology, a replicable system for producing confessions that could be taught to new inquisitors, applied in new locations, and defended in the institutional records that the Inquisition maintained with such remarkable thoroughness. England's relationship with judicial torture was, in legal theory, considerably more restricted than that of its continental neighbours. English common law, as it developed through the medieval period, did not formally recognise torture as a legitimate part of the judicial process in ordinary criminal cases. This theoretical prohibition was real, and it does distinguish the English legal tradition from the Roman law systems of continental Europe in meaningful ways. However, the practical reality of what happened inside English prisons, castle dungeons, and military facilities throughout the medieval period tells a more complicated story. The royal prerogative, the special powers reserved to the crown and exercised through the Privy Council, allowed torture to be ordered by royal warrant in cases deemed to affect the security of the state. These warrants, which survive in considerable numbers in the English state archives, authorized the application of specific instruments to specific named individuals for specific stated purposes. The rack at the Tower of London was used under royal warrant throughout the Tudor period and into the early Stuart era. What England had was not an absence of torture, but a system in which torture was officially exceptional, available only at the highest level of royal authority, while being practically available whenever the Crown determined that a case rose to that level, which, in the politically turbulent centuries of the late medieval and early modern period, was not infrequently. The executioner occupied one of the most paradoxical positions in medieval society. He was essential and despised simultaneously, required by the community and excluded from it in equal measure. In most medieval European jurisdictions, the executioner was prohibited from living within the town whose sentences he carried out. He was required to live at the margins, literally outside the walls, in a house that was often designated specifically for the purpose. He could not enter certain buildings. He could not shop at certain markets. His children could not marry into ordinary families. His touch was considered a form of contamination. And yet, he was paid by the municipality, granted a legal monopoly on his profession within his territory, and provided with a residence and a regular income that was, by the standards of many medieval trades, reasonably secure. The community needed him with an urgency that could not be disguised, and it expressed its discomfort with that need by making him a permanent outsider. He was the instrument of the court's will, the physical mechanism through which abstract legal sentences became concrete physical realities, and the community dealt with what that meant by ensuring that he remained visibly, permanently separate from the world whose dirty work he performed on its behalf. The psychology of the medieval executioner has been the subject of considerable historical speculation, because the documentary evidence about their inner lives is almost non-existent. What we have are guild records, payment documents, legal proceedings in cases where an executioner was accused of some offence, and occasional brief accounts in chronicles that mention them in passing. What we do not have, with very few exceptions, are personal testimonies, diaries, letters, or any record of how the men who performed these functions thought and felt about what they did. The exceptions are instructive. Franz Schmidt, who served as the executioner of Nuremberg from 1578 to 1617, kept a diary that has survived and has been extensively studied by historians. It is a document of extraordinary flatness, recording each execution and each flogging, with a brevity and a lack of apparent emotional engagement that has been interpreted in contradictory ways. Some historians read it as evidence of genuine psychological detachment, of a man who had so thoroughly compartmentalized his professional life that it produced in him no visible distress. Others read the very flatness of the language as a kind of evidence of suppression, of a person who had developed, out of necessity, a mode of recording that kept feeling at a maximum distance from fact. What the diary does not contain is any entry that could be read as enthusiasm, as satisfaction in cruelty, or as anything resembling what a modern person might call sadism. Schmidt appears to have been a craftsman who took his craft seriously and who understood it as a public service. Whether that understanding brought him peace is something the diary, despite its survival across 4 centuries, ultimately refuses to tell us. The transmission of torture techniques between regions and between generations happened through several distinct channels, each of which tells us something different about how this knowledge was preserved and spread. Inquisition manuals were the most formal channel, printed texts that circulated among ecclesiastical officials and were updated over time to reflect new challenges and new methods. But informal transmission was equally important and considerably less documented. Executioners travelled between cities to observe colleagues at work or to be observed themselves. Military campaigns moved soldiers and their methods across borders. Jewish and Muslim populations expelled from one region and settled in another sometimes brought knowledge of the judicial practices they had experienced as victims into communities that had not previously encountered those methods. The transmission of torture as a practice was, like the transmission of most medieval knowledge, a combination of the formal and the informal, the written and the embodied, the institutional and the deeply personal. The role of women in the administration of medieval torture is a subject that the historical record addresses only obliquely, but what it does preserve is significant. Women were almost never official torturers in the formal judicial sense. The role of executioner and the role of inquisitor were male by both tradition and law. However, women occupied adjacent positions in the system in ways that the records occasionally illuminate. Female assistants were sometimes required to be present at the examination of female accused, both for reasons of propriety and because certain procedures required a level of bodily access that male officials were nominally prohibited from providing. Midwives were called to examine women accused of witchcraft for the devil's marks that the prosecution claimed to be evidence of a diabolical compact. These women, operating within a system they had not designed and could not refuse to serve, performed functions that were instrumentally part of the torture process even if they did not themselves apply the instruments. Their presence in the records is fragmentary, and their voices are almost entirely absent. What we can reconstruct of their experience within this system is built largely from inference, from the gaps in the documents, rather than from what the documents actually say. The geography of the torture chamber itself was designed with psychological intention in ways that historians have only relatively recently begun to analyze systematically. The descent to a torture chamber, which in most castle and prison configurations required moving downward, underground, away from natural light and the sounds of ordinary life, was not simply an architectural necessity. It was a transition, a deliberate removal of the accused from the world they knew into a space that operated by different rules. The smell of torch smoke and stone damp and the residue of previous sessions was present before any instrument was applied. The sounds of the chamber, the drip of water, the creak of mechanisms being tested, the footsteps of multiple people in an enclosed space created an acoustic environment that was unlike anything in ordinary medieval experience. The chamber was a total environment, designed not consciously perhaps, but effectively to communicate to the person who entered it that they had passed beyond the reach of the ordinary world and into a space where the usual protections did not apply. Modern psychologists studying the effects of environmental manipulation on human cognition have described processes remarkably similar to what the architects of these spaces achieved through centuries of trial and error, rather than through any theoretical understanding of what they were doing. The use of torture in military contexts differed from its judicial applications in ways that the historical record captures imperfectly but suggestively. Military torture was less proceduralized, less documented, and less constrained by the legal frameworks that surrounded judicial practice. A commander who wanted information from a captured enemy soldier operated under different constraints than an inquisitor processing a heresy accusation. There were no notaries present. There were no formal warrants. There was no confirmation procedure to follow the next morning. What there was, in most cases, was urgency, the immediate military need for information that could not wait for a formal legal process, and the presence of people who had been trained in violence and who were not operating within an institutional culture that valued procedural restraint. The accounts that survive of military torture in the medieval period tend to appear in chronicles and in the letters of participants rather than in formal legal documents, and they describe practices that were sometimes more extreme than anything sanctioned by civilian courts, applied with a speed and an informality that the judicial system would not have recognized as legitimate, but that the military context made effectively unaccountable. The legacy of medieval torture in the legal systems that followed it is a subject of considerable complexity. The gradual abolition of judicial torture across European jurisdictions between the 17th and 19th centuries was driven by a combination of Enlightenment philosophy, changing ideas about the nature of evidence, the growing influence of voices within the legal profession who had for centuries argued that pain-produced confessions were inherently unreliable, and a shift in public sensibility about what the state was permitted to do to the bodies of its citizens. But abolition was neither swift nor complete. Frederick the Great abolished torture in Prussia in 1740, but exceptions remained for certain categories of crime. France officially abolished torture in 1788, on the eve of a revolution that would itself produce suffering on a scale that no medieval court had managed. England, which had always maintained its theoretical prohibition on torture while practicing it under royal prerogative, simply allowed the practice to atrophy rather than formally abolishing it. The last recorded use of the rack in England was in 1640, not because a law was passed against it, but because the political circumstances that had made it available changed. The instruments did not disappear immediately. In many cases they were preserved, displayed in the towers and castles where they had been used, transformed from tools into objects of curiosity that visitors came to examine with a mixture of horror and fascination that has not substantially diminished in the centuries since. The survival of torture instruments in museum collections across Europe raises questions that curators and historians have not fully resolved about what it means to preserve and display objects whose entire purpose was human suffering. The rack at the Tower of London, the thumbscrews in various Scottish museums, the fragments of Inquisition equipment preserved in Spanish collections. These objects occupy an unusual position in the landscape of historical memory. They are not beautiful. They were not made to be beautiful. They were made to work, and the work they were made for was the destruction of human beings. And yet their preservation is considered important, is considered a form of historical responsibility, because to destroy them would be to participate in a different kind of erasure, the convenient forgetting of what human institutions have been capable of designing and building and using against other human beings with the full backing of law. They sit in their display cases, behind glass, labelled and described in the careful neutral language of museum interpretation, and they ask a question of everyone who looks at them that the labels do not quite articulate. Not what were these for? That is answered. But what does it mean that they were made? What does it mean that they worked? And what does it tell us about the distance, or the lack of it, between the civilization that built them and the civilization that now displays them under careful lighting for the education of visitors on a Tuesday afternoon? Every story has to end somewhere. And the story of medieval torture, which has taken us through dungeons and courtrooms, through the chambers of the Inquisition and the public squares of 100 European cities, through the lives of executioners and the deaths of heretics, and the silence of people whose names the records never bothered to preserve, this story ends not with a single moment, but with a long, slow dissolution. A gradual loosening of something that had been tied very tight for a very long time. The ending was not clean. It was not sudden. It was not the result of one philosopher writing one book or one king signing one document, though philosophers wrote books and kings signed documents, and those things mattered. It was the result of a shift in something deeper and harder to name. A change in what European civilization was willing to say out loud about what it was doing to people in the name of justice, and what it was no longer willing to pretend it did not know. The reliability of torture as a means of producing true confessions was questioned by critics operating from within the medieval system itself, not only by later Enlightenment thinkers looking back from a distance. As early as the 13th century, voices within the church and within the legal profession argued that a person under sufficient pain would say anything their questioner wished to hear, that the confession produced was not a revelation of truth, but a performance of survival, and that courts which relied on such confessions were not discovering guilt, but manufacturing it. These arguments were made carefully and within the institutional language of the time, framed as concerns about procedure and reliability rather than as moral objections to the practice itself. They were largely ignored. The system had too much invested in its own methods to be easily argued out of them. But the arguments existed. They were preserved in legal texts and theological commentaries. And when the intellectual climate of Europe began to change in the 16th and 17th centuries, those earlier voices were still there to be found and built upon by people who were ready to take their implications more seriously. The case of Jean Calas, a French Protestant merchant executed in 1762 for the alleged murder of his son, became one of the most consequential legal scandals of the 18th century and one of the most powerful catalysts for the formal abolition of judicial torture in France. Calas was convicted on the basis of a confession extracted under torture and was broken on the wheel before being strangled and burned. The philosopher Voltaire took up his case, investigated the evidence, and published a work that demonstrated the conviction was almost certainly a product of religious prejudice and procedural coercion rather than of any actual guilt. The campaign Voltaire mounted, conducted through pamphlets and letters and the organized pressure of European intellectual opinion, resulted in the posthumous rehabilitation of Calas in 1765 and contributed directly to the climate that led to the formal abolition of judicial torture in France in 1788. The Calas case is significant, not only for what it achieved, but for what it demonstrates about the mechanism of change. The arguments against torture had existed for centuries. What changed was not the arguments, but the audience for them, and the willingness of that audience to act on what it already, on some level, understood. The Enlightenment philosopher Cesare Beccaria published his landmark work on crimes and punishments in 1764, just 2 years after the execution of Calas, and its influence on the subsequent history of criminal justice in Europe and the Americas was profound and lasting. Beccaria's argument against torture was not primarily a moral one, though moral considerations ran beneath it. It was rational and procedural. He argued that torture was simply a bad way to determine truth, that it punished the innocent and the guilty indiscriminately according to their physical capacity to endure pain rather than according to their actual guilt, and that a justice system built on such a foundation was not justice but its opposite. He proposed a model of criminal justice based on clear laws, proportionate punishments, and the presumption of innocence, ideas that seem self-evident to a modern reader, but that represented, in the context of 18th century European law, a fundamental challenge to everything that had been built over the preceding millennium. The book was immediately placed on the Catholic Church's Index of Forbidden Books. It was also immediately translated into French, English, and a dozen other languages, read by monarchs and revolutionaries alike, and cited in the legal reforms that followed in jurisdiction after jurisdiction across the following decades. The last formal judicial torture in England under royal warrant was recorded in 1640, applied to a man named John Archer in connection with a conspiracy investigation. The circumstances of his case are less historically significant than the date, which places the end of official English torture squarely in the period of the constitutional crises that preceded the Civil War. A period in which the royal prerogative that had always provided the legal basis for torture warrants was itself under sustained political attack. The end of torture in England was thus connected to a broader political transformation rather than to any specific legislative act or moral campaign. The Crown lost the unchecked power that torture required, and when the power went, the practice went with it. This pattern, in which torture ended not because of a principled decision against it, but because the political conditions that had sustained it changed, was repeated in various forms across different European jurisdictions. The abolition of torture was often less a moral achievement than a political consequence, which is perhaps why it proved, in subsequent centuries, to be less permanent than its advocates had hoped. The persistence of torture in colonial contexts, long after its formal abolition in European domestic law, represents one of the most significant and least comfortable aspects of the practice's long history. The same European powers that abolished judicial torture within their own borders during the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries continued to apply methods that were functionally identical to medieval practice in their overseas colonies, against populations that the colonial legal framework did not protect in the same ways it protected European subjects. The documentation of these practices is extensive, and the gap between what colonial powers said about torture and what they did in their colonies is one of the most thoroughly attested examples in history of the principle that legal protections tend to travel less far and less reliably than the power that is nominally subject to them. This is not a digression from the history of medieval torture. it is its continuation, the same logic applied in new geographies by institutions that had inherited their methods and their justifications from the centuries we have been examining. The preservation of medieval torture in popular culture, in novels and films, and the iconography of Halloween and the aesthetic of Gothic entertainment has created a version of this history that is both everywhere and curiously weightless. The Iron Maiden, which historians largely regard as a 19th century construction, has become more famous than most of the devices that were actually used. The dungeon as a space of Gothic romance, with its atmospheric darkness and its suggestion of forbidden knowledge, has almost entirely displaced the dungeon as a space of documented human suffering in the popular imagination. This transformation is not accidental. It serves a function. It allows the history to be present, to be referenced and invoked, and found aesthetically interesting, without requiring the full weight of what it actually was to be carried by the people who consume it. The horror is aestheticized. The suffering is decorative. And in that process, the people who actually experience these things, whose names appear in the Inquisition transcripts and the English torture warrants, and the court records of 100 medieval cities, are converted from human beings into scenery. Understanding this process, recognizing it when it happens, is part of what separates genuine engagement with this history from its entertainment version. And it is one of the reasons why taking the time to sit with this material seriously, as you have been doing tonight, matters more than it might initially appear to. The question of what medieval torture tells us about human nature is one that historians approach with considerable caution, and that philosophers have been considerably less cautious about. The temptation to read this history as evidence of a fundamental human capacity for cruelty, of something dark and essential in the species that expresses itself when institutional permission is given, is understandable, but probably too simple. What the history of medieval torture demonstrates more precisely is the capacity of human institutions to normalize practices that would, outside their institutional context, be recognized as monstrous. The men who operated the rack and the strappado were not, as best historians can determine, unusually cruel people. They were functionaries. They were doing their jobs. They were operating within systems that had been built over generations, that had their own internal logic and their own moral language, and that provided for the people working within them a framework of justification sufficiently robust to make what they were doing feel not only acceptable, but necessary and even virtuous. This is perhaps the most unsettling thing that the history of medieval torture has to tell us. Not that human beings are capable of cruelty, which we already knew, but that human beings are capable of cruelty while feeling that they are doing good, while believing that the suffering they are causing serves a higher purpose, while maintaining, inside the same mind that directs the tightening of the rope, a genuine sense of themselves as decent people carrying out a difficult but important responsibility. The voices that survive from within the medieval torture system, preserved in the extraordinary documentary record that institutions like the Spanish Inquisition left behind, are almost entirely the voices of the powerful. The inquisitors wrote the documents. The notaries transcribed the sessions. The legal scholars produced the manuals. The voices of the accused survive only in fragments, filtered through the language and the agenda of the institutions that recorded them, transcribed by people whose purpose was not to preserve testimony, but to document procedure. And yet, even through that filtering, something persists. A woman in a Spanish Inquisition record asked for the third time to confirm the confession she gave under torture, saying that she has nothing to say except what she has already said, and that she is tired. A man in a German court document asking, in the middle of a session, to be allowed to pray. A child in an English record saying that they do not understand the question. These fragments, preserved by accident in documents that were not designed to preserve them, are the closest we can come to the actual experience of what we have been describing tonight. They do not answer all the questions this history raises, but they insist, in their smallness and their humanity, that the questions be asked seriously and not set aside. The relationship between medieval torture and the development of modern legal systems is more direct and more significant than most legal histories acknowledge. Many of the protections built into contemporary criminal justice, the presumption of innocence, the right to legal representation, the prohibition on self-incrimination, the requirement that confessions be given voluntarily, the rules governing the admissibility of evidence were developed specifically in response to the abuses of the medieval and early modern torture system. They are not abstract principles that philosophers invented in a vacuum. They are answers to specific documented problems that the torture system created and that reformers spent centuries trying to solve. When a modern court rules that a confession obtained under coercion is inadmissible, it is applying a principle whose roots go back directly to the critics of Strappado and the peine forte et dure. The legal architecture of the present is built in ways that are rarely made explicit on the ruins of the system we have been examining tonight. The abolition of torture as an official legal practice in European jurisdictions was largely complete by the early 19th century, though the process had taken different forms and moved at different speeds in different places. Sweden abolished it in 1734, Prussia in 1740, Denmark in 1770, France in 1788. The various German states progressively through the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Russia, where torture had been officially prohibited by Catherine the Great in 1774 but had continued in practice, saw more genuine enforcement of the prohibition under subsequent reforms. The pattern across all these abolitions was similar. Official prohibition came first. Genuine cessation of the practice took longer. The gap between the two was filled by continued use under different names, by informal practices that did not appear in official records, and by the persistence of a culture within law enforcement and military institutions that had not yet absorbed the change in legal philosophy that the official prohibitions represented. Abolition on paper was not the same as abolition in practice. It was the beginning of a longer process that, depending on how the evidence is read, is still ongoing. The rediscovery and scholarly study of medieval torture records, which accelerated significantly in the 19th and 20th centuries, as archives were opened and catalogued and the documents made accessible to researchers, produced a literature of historical analysis that has itself evolved considerably over time. Early historians of the Inquisition tended to approach the material from within religious frameworks that shaped their conclusions in predictable ways. Catholic historians minimized the severity and frequency of torture within Inquisition proceedings. Protestant historians exaggerated it in ways that served their own institutional narratives. The secular historiography that developed through the 20th century working directly with the primary documents rather than through the filter of confessional interest, produced a more precise and more uncomfortable picture than either of its predecessors. The numbers were smaller than the Protestant tradition claimed. The procedures were more restrained than the most lurid popular accounts suggested. And it was all far more systematic, far more bureaucratic, and far more deeply embedded in the ordinary functioning of medieval society than anyone who preferred to think of these practices as aberrations had been willing to acknowledge. The medieval torture chamber exists today primarily as a destination. The Tower of London, the Castel Sant'Angelo in Rome, the dungeons beneath Edinburgh Castle, the preserved Inquisition buildings in various Spanish cities, all receive visitors who come to see the spaces and, where they survive, the instruments. The experience of visiting these places is structured by the institutions that manage them in ways that balance the demands of historical education with the practical realities of tourism. There are audio guides. There are information panels. There are reconstructions designed to make the past more vivid and accessible. And there are, inevitably, gift shops. The distance between standing in a room where people were broken on a rack and purchasing a novelty magnet shaped like a thumbscrew in the shop adjacent to that room is a distance that no institution has fully figured out how to manage, because it reflects a genuine tension in how modern culture relates to this material. We want to know. We want to understand. We want to feel the weight of what happened in these places. And we also want lunch and a souvenir. Both of these impulses are human. Neither of them is wrong. But the tension between them is worth noticing, because it is in that tension that the risk of aestheticization lives, the risk of converting suffering into atmosphere and history into entertainment. What we owe the people whose suffering built this history is not simple. It is not merely acknowledgement, though acknowledgement is necessary. It is not merely the preservation of records, though the records must be preserved. It is the harder and more ongoing work of understanding how the systems that produced these practices came to exist, how they were sustained across centuries, how they were justified by intelligent and, in many cases, genuinely devout people, and what that tells us about the conditions under which ordinary human institutions become capable of extraordinary harm. The medieval torture system did not arise from nothing. It arose from a specific configuration of legal authority, theological certainty, institutional power, and the deep human discomfort with uncertainty, with the possibility that truth might be inaccessible and guilt might be undiscoverable, and justice might sometimes simply be impossible. Torture was, among other things, a refusal to accept that uncertainty. A violent insistence that certainty could be produced, that the truth was in there somewhere, and that sufficient pressure applied to a human body would eventually bring it out. The refusal of uncertainty is not a medieval characteristic. It is a human one. And the history we have been exploring tonight is, in its deepest dimension, a history of what that refusal costs when it is given institutional power and theological sanction, and 1,000 years to develop its instruments. And now, having travelled through those long centuries together, through the dungeons and the courtrooms and the public squares, through the documented suffering of people whose names we know, and the undocumented suffering of the far greater number whose names we do not, it is time to let this history rest for tonight, not to forget it, never to forget it, but to set it down gently, the way you set down something heavy that you have been carrying for a long time, and to let the quiet come back in around you. If you are still awake, thank you for staying, for taking this seriously, for giving your attention to people who lived and suffered in a world very different from the one you are lying in right now, and who deserve to be remembered with more than the casual horror of a ghost story. History, at its best, is an act of attention paid to the dead, and you have paid that attention tonight. If this journey through the darker corridors of the past was something you found valuable, please consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a like on this video. It helps more people find their way here, to this quiet space where history is taken seriously and the past is given the weight it deserves. And if you have a thought, a question, something this video made you feel or want to know more about, leave it in the comments. Every one of them is read. For now, let your body settle. Let the stone corridors and the iron instruments and the flickering torchlight of the medieval world fade back into the distance where they belong. Let the documents close. Let the chambers go dark. Let the long history of human suffering and human resilience that we have moved through together tonight become something softer, something that sits quietly at the back of the mind rather than pressing at the front of it. You are here. You are safe. The world outside is still there, unchanged, waiting patiently for morning. Sleep well. Good night.